You ever notice how politics is a lot like poker? Everyone's bluffing until somebody flips the cards, and that's exactly what just happened. Chuck Schumer thought he could corner Trump with a government shutdown, but instead, Trump called his bluff and dropped an absolute bombshell that no one in Washington saw coming. In one move, he forced Democrats to defend the very same corporate giants they've spent decades attacking. And while that chaos exploded in D.C., another meltdown was already underway in New York. Just days after Mamdani's big win, his so-called progressive revolution is collapsing faster than the city's tax base, sending nervous investors, families, and billionaires on private jets straight to Florida, where real estate prices are skyrocketing overnight. It's a tale of two implosions, Schumer's political gamble and Mamdani's economic disaster, and they both reveal the same thing. When leaders build their power on illusion, reality eventually catches up. So today, we're breaking down how Trump's latest move didn't just shift the balance of power, it exposed the truth about what's really driving America's next big transformation. Let me paint you a picture of how we got here, because the setup matters. The government's been shut down. Actually, it became the longest shutdown in the nation's history. Now, shutdowns aren't new. We've seen them before, and honestly, most Americans have gotten pretty tired of the political theater that usually surrounds them. But this one's different, because buried in the middle of all the usual partisan squabbling is something that most people weren't paying attention to until recently. See, the Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer in the Senate, decided they had leverage. They figured, we'll hold the government hostage until we get what we want on healthcare subsidies. Specifically, they wanted Obamacare subsidies extended hundreds of billions of dollars flowing to insurance companies with the argument that this helps people afford healthcare. On the surface, that might sound reasonable, right? Healthcare is expensive, people need help, so subsidies seem like the compassionate choice. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is something I think a lot of folks our age understand instinctively, because we've seen how these things work over the decades. Just because money gets labeled as helping people doesn't mean that's where it actually ends up. Schumer's proposal wasn't just about extending help for another year. It was poison-pilled, as they say in Washington, loaded up with bonuses for insurance providers, billions and billions, going straight to the companies themselves, with zero actual guarantees that your premiums would go down even a penny. In fact, some estimates suggested that around 20 to 30% of these subsidies were fraudulent, money disappearing into administrative black holes, or worse, covering healthcare costs for people who weren't even supposed to be in the system in the first place. Now, Schumer thought he had Republicans in a corner. The calculation was simple. Republicans would face enormous pressure as the shutdown dragged on, military personnel not getting paid, air traffic controllers working without paychecks, thousands of federal workers caught in the middle. The longer it went, the more Republicans would get blamed, or so the thinking went. Eventually, they'd cave, Democrats would get their subsidies, and heading into midterm elections, they'd have something to campaign on. It was a classic Washington setup, very predictable, very traditional political hardball, except there was one fatal flaw in the whole strategy. The flaw was assuming that Donald Trump plays by traditional rules. He doesn't negotiate from fear. He doesn't operate on the usual timeline of political pressure. Instead, he waits, he watches, and when the moment's right, he doesn't just respond to your move, he changes the entire game you're playing. That's exactly what happened. Trump watched Schumer make his proposal public, watched Democrats line up behind it, watched the media frame it as a reasonable compromise. Then he waited exactly one day, just long enough for everyone to commit to their positions, and dropped what can only be described as a political bombshell. Trump posted on Truth Social and said, in effect, you want to spend hundreds of billions on healthcare? Fine. But let's stop sending it to money-sucking insurance corporations. Let's send it directly to the American people so they can buy their own healthcare and have money left over. Now, let me break down why this is so brilliant, because it's the kind of move that reveals how someone thinks several steps ahead. First, on the policy level, Trump's proposal essentially suggests creating something like health savings accounts on a national scale. Think of it like the education savings accounts that exist in many states. The government provides funds into a special account, and you decide how to spend it on healthcare-related expenses. doctor visits, medications, treatments, preventive care, you're in control. This kind of approach does a few things at once. It puts decision-making power back in your hands rather than in the hands of insurance company bureaucrats. It creates actual market competition because providers have to compete for your business. And perhaps most importantly, it cuts out the massive middleman costs and potential fraud that come with funneling everything through insurance corporations. But here's the political genius of the move, and this is what has Democrats absolutely scrambling right now. Trump just forced them into a position where they have to argue against giving money directly to the American people. Think about that for a second. The party that spent decades positioning itself as the champion of the working class, the party that rails against corporate greed and big business interests, is now in the awkward position of having to defend sending billions to insurance company executives instead of to regular Americans. It's a complete reversal of the expected political optics. Suddenly Republicans are the ones saying, let's give the people control and cut out corporate middlemen, while Democrats are stuck defending a system that enriches some of the most profitable corporations in America. How did that happen? The answer is that Democrats painted themselves into a corner by building so much of their healthcare policy around Obamacare. They're so invested in that framework politically, ideologically, structurally that they can't pivot without essentially admitting the whole thing was designed more to benefit insurance companies than to genuinely put healthcare in reach for average Americans. And you can see the panic setting in. Senator Chris Murphy called Trump's proposal nonsensical, but he didn't really explain why giving people money to buy their own healthcare is nonsensical. Online liberal activists started melting down, but again, without a coherent counter-argument beyond, we can't let Trump win. Some Democratic senators who usually toe the party line started making nervous comments about how maybe we need to look at alternatives. That's the sound of a bluff being called, and the person who made the bluff realizing they're holding nothing but bad cards. Meanwhile, Republicans smelled blood in the water. Senator Rick Scott from Florida immediately announced he's writing legislation to implement Trump's vision, actual health savings accounts that let Americans choose their own healthcare plans. Free market principles meeting populist direct support. Even Lindsey Graham, who's normally a pretty good barometer for where Senate Republicans are willing to go, called Trump's plan simply brilliant. But let's zoom out for a moment, because while this healthcare chess match was playing out in Washington, something equally dramatic was happening 1,500 miles to the northeast. And these two stories, Trump outmaneuvering Schumer and what's happening in New York, they're actually two sides of the same coin. You've heard about Zoran Mamdani winning the New York City mayor's race recently. Progressive candidate ran on a platform of equity, free programs, social justice, the whole package. Media called it a new chapter for the city. Supporters were ecstatic. The champagne was flowing on election night. And then the champagne kept flowing and flowing. Literally, within 72 hours of winning, the scandals started piling up faster than Manhattan real estate listings. First, it came out that Mamdani, the self-described democratic socialist who spent his entire campaign demonizing the wealthy, jetted off to a luxury resort in Puerto Rico for some kind of high-dollar conference with major Democratic donors and lobbyists. The guy who promised to give away free stuff to working people immediately went to party with political insiders at a place where rooms probably cost more per night than what many of his supporters make in a week. The hypocrisy was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But it got worse. Mamdani announced his transition team made a big show of it being all women, which the media dutifully praised as historic. But when people actually looked at who these women were, things got interesting. The co-chair turned out to be someone deeply connected to what some call dark money networks, with ties going back to the most establishment Democratic circles you can imagine. This was supposed to be the guy who was going to disrupt the establishment, drain the local swamp, bring fresh voices to City Hall. Instead, he was filling his administration with the exact same recycled political operatives from previous failed administrations, people from the de Blasio era, the Bloomberg years, Biden's Washington, the same cast of characters who'd presided over New York's decline, just with new titles. And then Mamdani turned around and asked his supporters for money after winning. after the election was over. He sent out fundraising appeals asking people to help fund his transition, even though transitions are fully paid for by state funds. The guy who promised free everything immediately started asking the people who voted for him to pay up. You can't make this stuff up. And the speed of it all, the whiplash between election night promises and week one reality, it created something interesting. It crystallized doubt. Even among people who voted for him, you started hearing this question, wait, did we just get played? But the political fallout was just the beginning, because Mamdani's win, and more importantly his immediate betrayal of the image he'd campaigned on, triggered something else entirely, something measurable, something you could track in real time. People started leaving. Not metaphorically, literally. They started booking flights, calling moving companies, and most tellingly, calling real estate agents in Florida. Now, we're not talking about a few folks here and there deciding to retire somewhere warm. We're talking about a surge, a wave of wealthy and even middle-class New Yorkers suddenly deciding that maybe they'd rather not stick around to see how this experiment turns out. Private jet booking services reported a spike of somewhere between 40 and 50% in flight requests from New York to Florida in the first couple days after Mamdani's win. 40 to 50% increase, that's not normal fluctuation, that's people fleeing. And where were they going? Mostly Palm Beach, areas near Mar-a-Lago, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, places where the governor has spent years building a reputation for competence, low taxes, and respect for personal freedom. Places that stayed open during times when New York was locked down. Places that have become symbols of an alternative approach to governance. One Miami real estate developer reported signing over $100 million in contracts from nervous New Yorkers in just a few months, doubling what they'd done the entire previous year. Properties that normally would sit on the market through Thanksgiving were entering contracts within days. The Florida real estate market didn't just heat up, it caught fire. And here's the twist that nobody saw coming. It wasn't even New Yorkers buying most of these properties yet, it was Floridians. Local investors and residents rushing in to purchase luxury waterfront properties before the expected wave of New York refugees arrived and drove prices through the roof. Think about that, people in Florida were essentially front-running the exodus, betting that the flood of displaced New Yorkers would create such demand that anything they bought now would be worth significantly more in a matter of months. One real estate agent down there called Mamdani COVID-2, and honestly, that comparison makes sense. Remember during the pandemic how Florida became this beacon, this refuge for people who wanted to live normally, work freely, send their kids to school, run their businesses? Millions of people discovered that there was an alternative to the lockdown, restrictive approach taken by places like New York and California. Florida became a symbol of something bigger than just a state. It became a symbol of choice, of trust in people to make their own decisions. Now, history is repeating itself, except this time it's not a virus people are fleeing, it's a politician. It's the realization that the promises made were hollow, that the progressive utopia being sold was just another way of concentrating power in the hands of people who don't trust you to run your own life. And when people reach that realization, they vote with their feet. They pack up decades of memories, leave behind neighborhoods they've lived in for generations, and head somewhere that respects them enough to let them be. That kind of movement, that's not politics. That's physics. That's human nature asserting itself against systems that don't work. But let's pull the lens back even further, because what's happening in New York isn't new. It's just the latest chapter in a story that's been playing out across American cities for decades now. Think about Chicago under ultra-progressive leadership. It's now at its lowest population in over a century. Nearly 200,000 people have left in recent years. Los Angeles has lost a similar number since 2020 alone. Baltimore, which was once one of the biggest cities in the nation back in the 1800s, had well over 1 million residents just a few decades ago. Today, barely 500,000. Detroit, Cleveland, Street, Louis, the list goes on and on. There's even a term for it now, urbanization. The slow death of American cities under monopolistic political control that prioritizes ideology over results, symbolism over solutions, and the pattern is always the same. Promise the world, deliver bureaucracy, raise taxes to fund programs that don't work, blame everyone else when things fall apart, drive out the productive people who are funding everything, watch the tax base collapse, repeat. It's unsustainable. and deep down, everyone knows it. These cities are built on a model that can't last. They require an ever-growing base of productive residents to fund an ever-growing list of programs and promises. But when you make it expensive, dangerous, or just plain frustrating to live somewhere, people leave. And when they leave, the math stops working. Some people call it the death of the American city, and in a sense, they're right. But maybe what's actually dying isn't the concept of cities, it's a particular kind of city. The kind built on control rather than trust. The kind where bureaucrats decide what's best for you rather than letting you decide for yourself. The kind where political machines perpetuate themselves regardless of whether they're actually improving anyone's life. And here's where our two stories, Trump versus Schumer and Mamdani's New York collapse, really come together into one bigger picture. What Trump just did with his healthcare proposal isn't just about healthcare. It's about trust. It's about saying, I trust you to make better decisions about your own medical care than some insurance company executive looking at a spreadsheet. That's a fundamentally different philosophy from what Schumer was offering, which essentially says, we'll send money to experts and corporations, and they'll take care of you, don't worry about the details. One approach treats you like an adult capable of making informed choices. The other treats you like a child who needs to be managed by people who supposedly know better. And that philosophical divide, trust versus control, that's the same divide that's driving people out of New York and into Florida. It's the same reason why working-class voters and independents flipped for Trump in such big numbers in 2024. These aren't Republicans in the traditional sense. Many of them voted for Obama twice. They're not ideological, they're practical. They just want a government that works for them instead of lecturing them. But here's what Schumer missed, and what Mamdani is learning the hard way. When you build your entire political identity around controlling things, around being the smartest people in the room who have all the answers, you can never admit that maybe your answers aren't working. You can never pivot, never adjust, never say we got this wrong. Because if you do, the entire house of cards collapses. Schumer spent years defending Obamacare as the solution to healthcare. So when Trump offers an alternative that's actually more populist, more direct, more empowering, Schumer can't say, hey, that's a good idea. He's trapped by his own rhetoric. Mamdani spent months promising to shake up the establishment, but he can't actually do it because he needs that establishment to govern. He needs the donors, the consultants, the bureaucrats who know how the system works. So he ends up becoming the very thing he campaigned against, and doing it so quickly that even his supporters feel betrayed. Both men made the same mistake. They confused control with competence. Contrast that with what we're seeing from Trump and from leaders like DeSantis in Florida. They're not promising to control everything. They're promising to remove obstacles and let people build their own lives. They're not claiming to have all the answers. They're claiming that you have the right to find your own answers. And weirdly enough, that message of trust is incredibly powerful right now, especially with people who've seen enough political promises come and go to know that the most dangerous ones are those that sound too good to be true. Think about Trump's other recent moves along these same lines. He ordered the Justice Department to investigate large meatpacking corporations for allegedly colluding to drive up food prices. He floated the idea of 50-year mortgages to help young people afford homes by lowering monthly payments. These aren't traditional conservative policies, they're populist interventions designed to address real costs that real people are feeling in their daily lives. The genius of this approach, from a pure strategy standpoint, is that it puts Democrats in an impossible position. They've spent so long positioning themselves as the party of the working class that when Republicans actually propose working class policies, Democrats either have to support them, which means Trump wins, or oppose them, which makes them look like they're defending corporate interests over regular people. It's a realignment that's been building for years, but it's accelerating now. The old categories of left and right don't quite fit anymore. Instead, we're seeing a divide between people who trust citizens to make their own choices and people who think experts and institutions should make those choices for them. Between people who think the system can be reformed to work for everyone and people who think the system is working exactly as intended for insiders. And when you look at Tuesday's elections through that lens, some interesting patterns emerge. Republicans showed up in strong numbers, absolutely. But Trump's 2024 coalition, which included huge numbers of working-class voters, Latino voters, young men, disaffected independents, a lot of them either stayed home or even drifted back toward Democrats in these recent local races. Why? Because they felt like the promises made to them were being forgotten. They felt like Trump was spending more time and energy on Middle East policy than on Middle America. They felt like their economic struggles, the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of healthcare, weren't being treated as priorities. That's the wake-up call that Tuesday's results delivered. And it appears Trump got the message loud and clear. Because everything he's done since the healthcare bombshell, the meat investigation, the mortgage proposal, it's all targeted directly at those exact concerns. It's a pivot back to the America First, kitchen table economics that built the coalition in the first place. This is why the shutdown, ironically, might turn out to be the best thing that could have happened for Trump politically. It gave him a stage to reframe the entire conversation around trust, around who's fighting for regular people versus who's fighting for corporate interests and political machines. And every day the shutdown continues, with Schumer stubbornly defending insurance company subsidies. It reinforces that frame. Every day Mamdani's in the news for another tone-deaf move or luxury getaway. It reinforces the broader narrative that progressive leadership is performative rather than practical. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds great in theory, but what does it actually mean for me? How does any of this affect my life? Fair question. Let me bring it down to earth. If Trump's health savings account proposal actually becomes law, you could potentially have more control over your healthcare spending and more options for how you receive care. Instead of being locked into whatever plan your insurance company offers, you'd have funds you could direct toward the doctors, treatments, and approaches that actually work for you. If the DOJ investigation into food prices leads to real action against monopolistic practices, you might see your grocery bill stabilize or even decrease. Same with the mortgage proposals. If your grandkids can actually afford to buy a home because payment structures become more flexible, that changes their lives and your family's future. And if the trend of people fleeing mismanaged cities continues, we might see a broader transformation in how America organizes itself. Not everyone packed into massive urban centers controlled by political machines, but spread out into smaller, more responsive communities where your voice actually matters and your vote counts for something. Some people are calling this vision freedom cities, new communities built around the principles of innovation, choice, and personal responsibility rather than bureaucratic control. Places where remote work means you can live anywhere. Where energy independence means you're not dependent on coastal elites for your power. Where local governance actually responds to local needs instead of copying whatever's trendy in New York or San Francisco. It's not just a political vision, it's a practical response to the failures we've been watching unfold. And it's already happening. The migration from New York to Florida is just the most visible example. But people are also moving to Texas, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Idaho, Montana, places that offer space, affordability, and governments that largely leave you alone to live your life. This is the flip side of urbanization, it's decentralization. It's the recognition that the old model of concentrating everything in a handful of massive cities controlled by a handful of political machines just doesn't work for most people anymore. And technology now makes it possible to live well, work productively, and stay connected from just about anywhere. That's something I think our older folks understand instinctively, even if you didn't grow up with all the technology that makes it possible. You remember when communities were more local, when you knew your neighbors, when local businesses were owned by people you actually knew. The internet and remote work are making that possible again, just in a new form. And when leadership, whether it's Trump reshaping the Republican Party or governors like DeSantis building alternatives to failed progressive policies, when leadership catches up with where people are already moving, that's when real change becomes possible. So let's bring both threads together one final time, because they really are telling the same story from different angles. Schumer's bluff failed because it was based on fear that Republicans would cave under pressure, fear that Americans wouldn't notice that billions were going to insurance companies instead of to them. Trump called that bluff by offering something better: direct support, personal control, and trust in citizens to make their own choices. Mamdani's rapid collapse happened because his entire campaign was built on fantasy, the fantasy that progressive policies work despite decades of evidence to the contrary. The fantasy that you can promise everything to everyone without consequences. The fantasy that people won't notice when you immediately betray everything you claim to stand for. Trump's bombshell healthcare proposal didn't just respond to Schumer's offer, it reframed the entire debate. It turned defense into offense. It made Democrats the ones defending corporate interests while Republicans championed direct support for regular people. It showed that chaos can become clarity when you have the courage to call out a broken system and propose something fundamentally different. And that's the leadership lesson in all of this. The thing I think is worth holding on to as we watch how this all plays out. Real leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting people enough to let them find their own answers. It's about removing obstacles rather than creating dependencies. It's about results instead of rhetoric. The movement, we're seeing people fleeing failed cities, voters rejecting establishment candidates, citizens demanding governments that actually work for them. It's not partisan. It's not left or right in the traditional sense. It's a rejection of incompetence dressed up as expertise. It's a rejection of control disguised as compassion. If you want to know where America's headed, just follow where trust and people are moving. Follow where families feel safe, where businesses can thrive, where communities function without being micromanaged from distant capitals. Follow where leaders say, I trust you instead of I'll take care of you. That's the future taking shape right now, in real time, in the decisions of millions of individual people who are simply choosing to live somewhere that respects them. Schumer and Mamdani represent the old model, the one that's collapsing under its own weight. Trump's latest move represents something different. I bet that Americans, given the choice and the resources, will make better decisions for themselves than any government bureaucrat or corporate executive ever could. We're watching a realignment happen. The question isn't whether it will continue, it will. The question is whether political leadership will recognize it and adapt, or whether they'll keep doubling down on approaches that have already failed, losing more trust and more people with every passing year. As for me, I'm optimistic. I've seen enough to know that when the American people decide they've had enough of something, they change it. Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes it's messy. But it happens. And right now, the momentum is shifting toward trusting people, toward letting communities flourish, toward leadership that serves rather than controls. That's not a left or right thing. That's an American thing. And it's worth fighting for. So here's what I want to ask you. If you believe leadership should serve people, not corporations or political machines, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for tomorrow's deep dive, and drop a comment below. Do you think Democrats will double down, or finally admit they've been outplayed? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you're thinking as all of this unfolds. Because at the end of the day, this isn't really about Trump or Schumer or Mamdani or any individual politician. It's about whether we're going to have a country where people are trusted to run their own lives, or one where every decision gets made by someone in a distant office who's never walked in your shoes. I know which one I'm betting on, and I think you do too.